Today on Stories from Real Life with Melvin E. Edwards, we're diving into the heart of what makes relationships work, and sometimes what makes them fall apart. My guest, Dr. Bruce Chalmer, is the co-host of the podcast and author of the book Couples Therapy in 7 Words. He has helped countless couples navigate love, conflict, trust, and intimacy with insight, humor, and a whole lot of heart.
Like, if I was going to boil it all down, what am I really doing with people? I guess what I'm trying to convey is be kind and don't panic. Now, what I mean by be kind, I don't mean just be nice. Yes, we should all be nice to each other. I mean be kin. Recognize your kinship with this other person, because that's what keeps people wanting to stay together. That's what the bond is all about. You can't do that if you're in a panic. So many of the techniques I learned and the stuff I was doing with folks was all about, hey, how can we talk about this stuff without crossing over into panic?
Whether you're in a relationship, looking for one, or just curious about what makes human connection tick, this conversation is packed with wisdom you can take into your own life. So pull up a chair. It's story time with our guest, Dr. Bruce Chalmer.
You are listening to Stories from Real Life, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thank you for joining me for the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. As you heard in the intro, our guest today is Dr. Bruce Chalmer, who is, with his wife, co-host of the podcast Couples Therapy in 7 Words. Bruce, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So how did you and your wife meet and decide to collaborate on a podcast and a book?
Well, that's two big questions. How did we meet, and how do we? Yeah, so it is a second marriage. We've been married now for 21 years. Okay. The very short story of my first marriage was that both my ex and I went on to marry really wonderful women, and we're both a lot happier that way. So that's kind of the short story of that. And so my wife and I met actually. We have one of our podcast episodes. We sort of tell our origin story. So I'll direct folks if they're interested in that. They can find us. The name of the podcast is Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I'll probably have occasion to describe what I mean by the 7 words. So that's how we got together many years ago. The way we decided to do a podcast. Well, I've written 3 books now on various couples therapy things. I'm in the middle of working on a 4th. And the first one of those, called Reigniting the Spark, came out. The publication date was February 29th, 2020. Now, if you remember back, that was Leap Day, right? That was kind of supposed to be this really cool day to release it, right? What happened then? Everything shut down. So, COVID. So there we were. I had a new book and no way to do any sort of public events, in person to promote it. So we thought about it, and somebody suggested, hey, do a Facebook Live thing. And so I invited my wife, Judy Alexander, to do it with me because she's great. She's got a great voice. She's great on the air. And we have a lot of fun together. So we did that launch together, and people said, oh, you guys should do a podcast. And we said, well, that sounds like fun. So here we are. And we've been doing a podcast now for the past 5 years. I think we just put out episode 218 or something like that. Nice. We've had a whole bunch of episodes, lots of really fascinating guests, as I'm sure you relate to. And so we just keep doing it because it's fun.
That's awesome. So how did your background as a therapist shape the structure of your books and your podcast?
Well, so I've been in private practice now for over 30 years. And over that time, I started off, the training I got initially was it included couples work, family work, and also individual work. I did lots of work with all of those, especially lots of individual, lots of couples. Over the years, I got more and more interested in working with couples. There was just something, and I don't know exactly how to say why, except it just appealed to me. There's something inspiring about helping people who are in such, they're in a lot of pain, of course. That's why they're consulting me. They're trying to figure out what to do. And, sometimes they stay together and sometimes they don't, but they're always trying to heal. And it just feels like a great privilege to be invited into that. It's so, and the ramifications are large, and it is with working with individuals too, but especially with a couple, because there are kids and there are families and there's communities involved. It's a bigger system. even when I was working with individuals, I always felt a sense of responsibility to their larger systems as well. Even if I had never met their spouses, I was still feeling like, well, this work needs to be responsible for them too, accountable to them too. So I've always had that kind of orientation to the work. And so I got more and more into working with couples. So I don't know how long ago it was, 15 years ago, maybe. I started doing a bunch of videos because it was fun. I enjoyed it. And after a few years of that, I realized, this goes back now maybe 6, 7 years, I realized, I think I have a book worth of stuff here. So that's how I created that first book, and then things have proceeded since then. Probably worth at this juncture mentioning the 7 words of when I say couples therapy.
Very next question.
There you go. Good. We're in sync. That's great.
Okay, yes. So can you share the 7 words and explain what they matter, how they or why they matter in couples therapy?
Yes, indeed. So the 7 words are: be kind, don't panic, and have faith. You have to count "and" to get 7.
Okay.
I could have said it's 6, but 7's a much better number. It's got that sort of biblical sense to it. 7 words, 7 days of the week, that sort of thing. So where that came from originally is, I mentioned, 30 years in private practice. Early on in that, sometime in the first couple of years, I was at a consultation group meeting. It was a bunch of, a few colleagues, I don't know, 5 or 6 of us getting together. I think it was in my office, as I recall. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We were sitting around talking, and we were getting up to leave. It was the end of this session. And one of my colleagues, who was a friend of mine, and he turned to me and he said, "How do you do couples therapy anyway?" Which he knew was a silly question. We're walking out of the room. What am I supposed to say? But I had actually given that some thought. And I said, well, it's funny. I've been wondering that myself. Like, if I was going to boil it all down, what am I really doing with people? I guess what I'm trying to convey is be kind and don't panic. Now, what I mean by be kind, I don't mean just be nice. Yes, we should all be nice to each other. I mean, be kin. Recognize your kinship with this other person, because that's what keeps people wanting to stay together. That's what the bond is all about. You can't do that if you're in a panic. So many of the techniques I learned and the stuff I was doing with folks was all about, hey, how can we talk about this stuff without crossing over into panic? So that was 5 words, right? Be kind and don't panic. And so and the colleagues said, well, that's sort of interesting. And I started sharing that with some of the folks I work with. And they said, wow, that's, I like that. That's interesting. Tell me, how do you not panic? And they had me there. Because it's like, well, what's the answer to that? Well, just don't. Well, that doesn't really help that much.
Something else.
Yeah, do something else. But when you're panicking, panic is a necessary physiological function. We have to be capable of panicking. We are the descendants of people who panicked too much rather than too little. The ones who panicked too little got eaten and didn't have children. That's how evolution works. So we are the ones, we tend to panic more than we should rather than less than we should. Nature errs on the side of too much panic. So the panic is going to be part of the deal. So how do you manage to get through this hard stuff without panicking? Well, what I noticed was, if I looked at the couples who seemed to be able to do that versus the couples who didn't seem to be able to do that, the difference was what I call faith. And I say what I call faith. I mean, people know the word faith. I don't necessarily mean religious faith. I have known religious people who show the kind of faith I'm thinking of, but I've known religious people who don't seem to have that kind of faith, and vice versa. I've known people who are not at all religious in their practice or beliefs who show it, and those who don't. So what do I mean by faith? What I mean by faith is, and it's like a mindset. It's a way of viewing the world. It's basically a way of viewing the world that says, for all the pain, for all the difficulty, for all the stuff I can't understand, nevertheless, this whole business is somehow right to be what it is. It's somehow good. Now, religious people might well say, oh, you mean God is good. Whatever God means, God is good. And yes, and I'm religious. I'm Jewish. I'm not fundamentalist in my beliefs or practice, but I am very much involved in my faith. So I'm used to that idea. It's like, yeah, I'm not afraid of the word God, and I'm not afraid of the notion that, well, whatever God means, God is good. We can't possibly understand God's ways, but there's something about it that's right. That's what I mean by faith. But there are plenty of people who aren't oriented toward religion who would still say, yeah, there's something right about this whole universe business. It's right to be what it is. The folks who could do that, if you think about situations like I work with frequently with couples, they're coming in initially, they're in pain. Why are they in pain? Well, for example, this is a very common one. There's been infidelity. There's been some kind of betrayal. There's been something really bad that's happened to them, and they're hurting. They're trying to figure out if they want to stay together or how to stay together. The ones that show faith come in and say, look, this is awful. The one who did the cheating is usually feeling guilty and appropriately, and the one who was cheated on is feeling angry or hurt and all of those things. But the ones who have faith are saying, all right, this was awful, but the one who was cheated on is basically saying, but I know you're not evil. I know you're not crazy. You did this. It's not characteristic of you. If I thought it was characteristic of you, I'd divorce you. It's like, well, yeah, if you're just a habitual cheater, don't try to be married to you. But I know that isn't you, and yet you did it. There must be something meaningful. It's wrong. It's morally wrong, but there must be something meaningful. That's a manifestation of faith that says, okay, we're going to have to understand this, even though it's painful. Those are the couples that then did the work and maybe stay together or maybe not, but they would heal. The couples that would come in and say, this is terrible, they all say that, but we just want to go back to how it was. It was fine. Why did you do this? And the person who cheated is saying, yes, I was crazy. I'll never do it again. Well, that's not going to get them anywhere because they probably aren't crazy. They probably aren't evil. I mean, if they are, as they say, then don't try to be married. But the vast, that's a statement of faith from my perspective. Mm-hmm. I assume the folks I'm working with from the get-go are not crazy, evil, or stupid. They're just not. Do they screw up? Yeah, we're human beings. We all do. But not crazy, evil, or stupid. So there must be some meaning there. And that's what faith is. You're seeking that meaning. So that's where the 7 words came from, basically.
Okay, nice. So which of the 7 words do you think couples struggle with the most?
Great question. I mean, I'd say all of them, really. But, if the way I kind of set it up, if you think about it, it's be kind. Well, you can't do that if you're in a panic, so don't panic. Well, the way to not panic is to have faith. So I suppose I could trace it all back to faith. If you have that kind of faith, you've got a shot at dealing with hard stuff without panicking, which means you can actually sense kinship. So, I kind of, the key, and I've written about this in all my books, and it's funny because I'm not writing to a religious audience per se. I'm not saying, oh, you have to be, I happen to be Jewish. I'm certainly not saying you have to be Jewish. I'm not saying you have to be Christian. I'm not saying you have to be anything. I'm saying, but faith is the key. So that's the one I tend to work up to. It's like, okay, and right in the first session, when I mentioned earlier that, telling people, well, I know you're not crazy, that's a statement of faith. I do that right in the first session. It's usually about 20 minutes in. I've done like a family diagram. I've asked them a couple questions in the beginning, but then I usually look at the couple and say, well, okay, it's when I'm talking about the notion of stability and intimacy. Those two, I call those the 2 basic needs you need: stability and intimacy. When I'm talking about stability, I usually say, well, now that we're old buddies because I've known you for 20 minutes, I can already tell neither one of you is nuts. And they usually smile and say, well, you haven't seen me at my worst or whatever. And I do not mean to be making fun of serious mental health issues, which occasionally, in over 30 years, every once in a great while, there will be a couple I won't say that to because maybe somebody is having a psychotic break or somebody is having a manic episode or something like that where they are nuts. But typically not. Typically they may have very different views, but they're not crazy. And that's just a statement of faith. It's like, well, let's assume that. Now we better work with it. Because there's something right about it, even though you shouldn't have done what you did, or, it's a bummer that you're in such pain, but let's work with it.
Okay. So how do the 7 words apply to relationships beyond romantic relationships?
Yes.
Families and friends.
Yeah. Well, families, friends, and politics, the world in general. And here I love to give a shout out to an organization, and maybe you've heard of it, called Braver Angels. Have you ever heard of them?
I have not. No.
Yeah, well, I want to give a shout out to them, and actually, another organization that have some overlap in some of the folks who are involved, which is called the Pro-Human Foundation. So I want to give a shout out to them too, and it relates to your question actually. Okay. So Braver Angels was founded in 2016, and when in politics, a lot of folks would look at politics, and around the time of the first Trump campaign, such polarization, and I'm old enough, folks who aren't seeing me may not know how old I am, but I'm 74 years old. I'm not a young guy, that I remember the 60s. There was lots of polarization in the 60s as well, of course, but the polarization has been really awful in this country to the extent that, people and families aren't talking to each other, friends are breaking up. I mean, all kinds of stuff that's happening, talking across the red-blue divide. broadly speaking. Braver Angels was founded, one of the co-founders, it was a couples therapist, Bill Doherty. And it's founded to get people talking across that divide. And it's really interesting in how it does that. Well, the Pro-Human Foundation is another organization, which, as they say, a lot of the same folks are involved in the two organizations. That one was co-founded by a man named, what's his last name? Daryl. I'm spacing out his last name. Oh, that's terrible. Anyway, sorry about that. But I'll probably think of it. Who is a jazz musician. That's his main gig is a jazz musician, pretty well known in the jazz world, I guess. You'd think I would remember his last name, but my excuse is I'm 74 years old. And he's a black man. So what does he decide to do? He decides he's going to go to some KKK meetings and figure out why. His question was, why do people hate me who don't even know me? Incredible courage. And maybe crazy, I don't know, to do something like that. I mean, presumably you can relate. I can relate as a Jew, you can relate as a black man, right? It's like, holy cow, how could somebody do that? Anyway, he does that. So he goes to, he actually contacts the Imperial Wizard of the KKK, and who doesn't know he's black. And they decide to meet, and the Imperial Wizard is thinking, oh, maybe a potential recruit, So they show up together. Daryl has, God, I can't think of his last name. I should look it up. Whatever.
I actually know that story, but I don't know his name either. So
yes. He's been covered on like 60 Minutes and some of the magazine shows. So anyway, to fast forward to the end, turns out over time he's got about 200. They didn't all send in their robes, but like 200 guys who renounced white supremacy after getting to know him. And it's just an amazingly inspiring sort of story. Well, all of that relates to, I can easily put that on my little, be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And the have faith part especially, because how did he go about, and I know other stories like this too. There's a well-known guy, again, who's, now I can't think of his first name. I can think of his last name because it's sort of ironic. His last name is Black. He's a white guy whose last name was Black, he was being groomed to be the head of this white supremacist organization that his father was the head of. And he went to, I think it was the University of Florida, and he was befriended by an Orthodox Jewish student who invited him to come to a Sabbath dinner. No, and they knew perfectly well who he was and what it was about. And he wasn't saying, "Oh no, I've given up that white supremacy stuff." Not at all. He was feeling like, no, what I am espousing isn't harmful. It's a way of viewing things that, everybody would be better off if we saw things this way. So he goes to these things where, who is he seeing? He's seeing this Orthodox Jewish student and his Jewish friends, his black friends, his, friends of all sorts of diverse type friends who are coming to these things. And over time, this guy renounces white supremacy. He didn't do it because they yelled at him. He didn't do it because they said he was stupid or evil for believing what he believed. He did it because he was actually in an atmosphere of respect, mutual respect. And is it Johnson? Is it Daryl Johnson? Whatever it is. Sorry, Daryl. When he would go to these KKK meetings, he would not go and say, "How could you people are all wrong?" He would go and just say, "Hey, what is this about?" And it's interesting because I remember seeing some footage, of him there, and the KKK guys were respecting him. They were thinking him inferior, but they were respecting him. They were saying, "Well, here you are. We'll talk to you," And it's that mutual respect that somebody starts wondering, gee, maybe I should reconsider, this idea that some people are superior to other people just by virtue of whatever, So I just find that incredibly inspiring. Well, that's all about faith. To me, that's what I mean by faith. It's starting with that, like you can actually talk to people. Now, there are limits on how much that would work. I think I remember some quote from Gandhi. I'm sure I'm misquoting, but this is what I'm remembering seeing. I don't know if you're familiar with it, where he said, back in the 1940s, he said something along the lines of, yeah, this nonviolence thing is great, but probably wouldn't work with Hitler. Hitler would just kill everybody. So there are limits on how much just respect will work. Sometimes you have to fight. I'm not a pacifist, but the basic idea that the way that the world heals is by what I call intimate conversation. And I don't mean sexual. I mean conversation where you're actually open to what the other person is saying and you're honest about what you're saying. That's how the world heals. That's where the magic happens. And so that's what those, the Daryl, whatever his last name is. I'm so embarrassed to not remember that because I've said it 17 zillion times, but there you go.
I'll look it up and I'll put a link in the show notes.
Appreciate that.
I can relate to that story because last year, at the beginning of the year, I started the year with a 2-part episode with a Klansman, former Klansman who had recently left the Klan. Mm-hmm. And we started following each other on social media after our conversation. And then I stopped following him because it was better for me not to see his day-to-day interactions with other people. Mm-hmm. I thought it'll be better. We have a better chance of forming some type of relationship, friendship, whatever, if I don't see how his mind works on a minute-by-minute basis, like people post on social media.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's interesting. Yeah. You only have so much stomach juice you can invest in that. But it's interesting because you could, I don't know, tell me if I'm hearing you right. You could still respect him, even though you recognize, you're coming from very different frames of reference. But you could still have a relationship. You could still respect him and have conversations.
Yeah. I saw him in a documentary and I went, he was speaking in nearby and I went to hear him. And the bond that started the conversation was we both have sons who play baseball.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah, that's what it takes. Exactly. It's like, isn't that interesting? Turns out we have something in common. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So what have been some of the most memorable or surprising moments of your podcast?
Oh, the podcast. That's an interesting question. Wow. I don't know about surprising. I mean, it's always surprising because we never know exactly what we're going to get. We've had some fascinating guests. We have numbers of sex therapists. It's turned out just by nature of the fact that we're a couples therapy podcast and have come at things from all sorts of different perspectives that I've just found fascinating. Lots of those. We actually, one of the people we had on was Wilk Wilkinson, who is involved he now works for Braver Angels. And he has a podcast called Derate the Hate. And I really enjoyed, I was on his and he came on ours and I really enjoyed having him on as well. Just, in terms of, he is a conservative Christian who had very critical things to say about how, especially how the NIH was handling the COVID thing. And Francis Collins, who was the head of NIH at the time, ended up reaching out to him and they had become fast friends. And they actually go around doing a sort of a dog and pony show. So that was really interesting. We had another guest once where we had her on talking about whatever work she does. Again, she's sort of in the sex therapy area or sex education area. But she then, on her podcast, she described the situation where somebody had plagiarized her work. Wow. And she reached out to the person who plagiarized her work and talked about how painful this was. And they had an amazing conversation, talk about healing. And that was really neat. We had her back on to talk about that experience. So that was kind of cool too. The stuff really, you don't expect. Yeah.
That is really cool.
I'm curious, if I may, I'm going to ask you a similar question because you do a podcast. Like what have been some of the most, surprising things and on your podcast?
Well, I've only done I've only had 2 guests where I've had 2 episodes with them, like back-to-back episodes, 2-part series. One was the Klansman that I mentioned earlier, and one was just a couple weeks ago with a former.
I heard part of that one. Yeah, the guy got out of the cult. Yeah.
Yes, I really found that to be fascinating, and he and I exchanged text messages a couple times a week because I just have so many questions and. Normally, I have about a dozen questions for my guest for an episode. Mm-hmm. And I had, when I was putting together the preparation for that guest, I had 9 pages of questions.
Wow.
I had to trim in probably about half. But I still wanted to ask him more questions. And he's been very open and we've been texting and it's been fun.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. That's, one of the joys of doing this. The reason my wife and I keep doing it is because it's fun and we learn, you never know exactly what you're going to get.
Absolutely.
I will note the other thing, just for some reason or other, a couple of months ago, I counted up how many guests we had up to that point, and it was 100 and some. And I think it was at that point, it was like 102. And 101 of them were fabulous. And not all fabulous. 101 of them were great. You know, I mean, we had nice conversations. There was only one person out of that 102 where afterward, my wife and I turned to each other and said, boy, that was kind of painful. And I'm not, of course, not going to say who it was. And the interesting thing is, you'd never in a million years know. I am sure of this. You would never know from hearing the podcast which one it was. That was just interesting. And it was only, you know, it wasn't, you know, we didn't get into any arguments or anything. It was just somebody who didn't interact. You know, they were just saying what they were saying, and they, you know, they had their thing, and they weren't gonna. There was no back and forth
from their script.
Yeah, exactly, and that was just kind of painful. But anyway,
I've had a couple really boring guests, but I won't say.
Yeah,
not today. You're not it. You're not
I hope not. Well, you know, we'll see. We still got some to go. Maybe we can.
Not over yet. Okay, yeah. So I've got more questions on regarding you and your wife. How have your views on relationships evolved through producing your show together?
Wow, that's a great question. You know, that is an interesting question. I think we both said, I know she said, and I've said as well, we both learned a lot. So I think that has spiced up our relationship some, just in terms of we learn stuff and we talk about stuff and we think about stuff, and it just sort of opens up more possibilities. So I think that's how we evolve. It feels like growth. You know, it really, to do that, to interact that way. I suppose that's kind of what I mean when I mentioned earlier about, you know, I have a hokey name for them, the two golden gifts, I call them: stability and intimacy. That's what a relationship needs. And the part that the learning new stuff gives you is the intimacy part. You know, the stability is all about, and it's important. They're both important. I'm not knocking stability, but you know, most of the folks who consult me, just in terms of, you know, who's going to show up in an outpatient, therapy practice, they're pretty good at stability. You know, they've often been together quite a while. That itself speaks to stability. You know, as I mentioned, they're not crazy. So they've got some stability there. The problem they're having is often in the general domain of intimacy. And I don't just mean sex. I mean more generally. They're having trouble being, you know, like they're walking on eggshells with each other. They're having trouble risking being honest, you know. I think one of the things that happens with our podcast, that happens with intimacy in general, we have these intimate conversations, and it helps us in our own intimate life as well. So I think we enjoy it because of that.
Nice. All right. So what type of feedback have you received from listeners that's really stuck with you?
The biggest one we get is they see the chemistry between us. And that, you know, we don't set out to say, let's demonstrate our chemistry. You know, it just shows up. But I think that is an important part of what we do, because people see, not only are we talking about all these various things with our guests, or sometimes, you know, about half our podcasts are just the two of us. We're talking about whatever we're talking about, but what people see is, wow, these two people really seem to enjoy each other. And that message itself is a useful message. It's like, oh, that's possible, isn't it? And, you know, as I say, we're a second marriage, but we've been together for over 20 years, and we're still feeling that way. So that itself is kind of an implicit message that says, yeah, it doesn't have to go away. You know, the spark does not have to go away. What is it that makes it possible for it not? Well, that's where, you know, that's the content of of the 7 words, you know, be kind, don't panic, and have faith. How do you implement all of that? Well, read my books. You know, that's what my various books are about.
All right. So for couples who may be hesitant about couples therapy, how do you help them to seek therapy, or for people who think it might not help them?
Yes, I have a whole, in fact, the book I'm working on is going to have a whole section on this. I have, in addition to those 3 books, I had a couple little booklets I put out, which, you know, I haven't really done much to promote, but I actually did a video of one of the chapters of one of those booklets, and it's going to be very similar to the chapter that's going in my new book. It's called, and this is aimed especially at women, How to Get Your Reluctant Guy to Go to Couples Therapy with You. Because I am stereotyping some, but it is almost always men who resist and almost always women who want to do it. And there's all kinds of good reasons for that. I don't pathologize that for women or men. It's like, yep, that makes sense. Women are way more used to talking about emotional stuff than men are. And women are way more comfortable with it. And women see it as a solution, and men dread it. We don't admit we dread it. because we're men. We don't want to claim that we're afraid of anything, God forbid, but we're terrified. And so that question, you're like, yeah, how can I recommend that? Now, of course, the folks who are already coming to see me have already jumped over that hurdle, right? They're there already. So the issue is, what about people, as they say, overwhelmingly women? What about people who are saying, how do I get my partner to go with me? I think it could be helpful. My basic message there is, if you really want the guy, and again, I'll keep the genders that way. If you really want the guy to listen to you and have some hope of considering what you're saying, you're going to have to respect what he's fearing. He won't tell you he's afraid, usually. Most guys don't say that. What the guy will say is, well, you're the one who's unhappy, so you go. Or they'll say, oh, therapy is for crazy people, or therapy is for weak people, or whatever, all of those things. There's less of that than there used to be. I think there's less stigma than there used to be, but that's still around a lot, especially among guys. So he'll say those things. And what the woman will be thinking is, oh, see, he doesn't care enough about me to do this. I want to do it, and he doesn't care enough. It's not that he doesn't care enough. It's that he's terrified. Why is he terrified? He's terrified that you'll go to therapy and break up. And that's not a bizarre thing to be terrified of. If you look around, perhaps folks, I certainly do, lots of people know folks who have broken up and they have gone to therapy. They went to therapy and it didn't do them any good in terms of staying together. And it's true. I don't count it as a success or failure if people stay together or not. I'm there to help them heal. Sometimes healing is about breaking up. Again, that's not for me. I'd have a definite bias in my work toward helping people stay together if they can. I mean, if they want to. I'm helping people want to, because I think that's far less disruptive. I'm a fan. I like monogamy. I'm a fan. But that fear is justifiable. So if the woman can recognize, oh, you know what? I see why you're afraid. I can understand why you are. Like, yeah, it is risky. And the other things the guy's afraid of, he's afraid that the therapist will side with the woman, which therapists often do. And I'm not saying it has to be a contest, but I'm just saying there's lots of therapists who will just, the orientation of the field is more feminine than masculine. And I say that as a heterosexual guy myself, but that makes sense. It's not surprising for the same reasons I was talking about. Women are the ones who like to do this, So he's afraid of that. He's afraid that even if the therapist doesn't take sides, the therapist will bring out the fact that he's basically a jerk as far as his wife is concerned, and she'll leave him. Because maybe sometimes he is a jerk. Unfortunately, we all are on occasion. I hope they're rare. So all of that stuff, his fears are legitimate. That's basically what it is. It's about respecting him rather than putting him down, rather than saying why you don't care about me. You're not, you're a bad person. Well, he's not going to listen to you if you're saying he's a bad person. So that's basically, that's how you can get over that. But not everybody gets over that hump, right? So sometimes people do go on their own. There is some research. In fact, Bill Doherty, I mentioned him with respect to Braver Angels. Bill Doherty's done some research with some colleagues where he's shown that individual therapy is associated with a greater risk of breaking up than not. In other words, I'm not saying individual therapy is bad, by the way. I'm just observing when somebody's having relationship problems and they go to individual therapy, they are more likely to break up than if they didn't go to individual therapy. Because lots of individual therapists will, perhaps without even realizing it, will disparage the relationship. Because what are they hearing? They're hearing from one person who's complaining about their relationship, and understandably. And so they'll be sympathetic to that, and they will again, either sometimes quite knowingly, but often not knowingly, undermine the relationship. So that is a phenomenon. Again, I'm not saying people shouldn't do individual therapy, but it's just a phenomenon to be on the lookout for.
Okay, that's a good tip. So we hear a lot about red flags, but what are some green flags that couples should look for in a healthy relationship?
Oh, I like that question. That's neat. I don't think I've heard that question before. Yeah, what are the green flags? Respect. Well, actually, and I'm going to add to that. Respect is fundamental. So you don't want to be with somebody who doesn't seem to respect you, who puts you down or who is just dismissive of your feelings or things like that. That's a red flag. But the green flag is you're with someone who shows you respect. But that's not enough, interestingly, because you also want someone who is willing to displease you, not because they're a jerk, not on purpose, not because they're setting out to displease you, but they're willing to be honest with you, even if you don't want to hear it. So you want that too. So those are the two, I could say kind of the two bases of stability and intimacy. You want somebody who will respect you so that you don't feel like, oh my God, everything is shaky, but you also want someone who's willing to rock the boat a little bit in the interest of intimacy. And that is a phenomenon I've heard a lot of over the years. I've been doing it, as I said, for 30 years plus. And I've noticed there's lots of women who will say, I just wish he wouldn't be so afraid of me. I mean, maybe that's not the language they would use, but they're saying, I want him to sweep me off my feet, but he's so respectful. He won't initiate anything. He won't try anything, I'll let him know if I don't like it. I want him to do it. And the guy is mystified because he's thinking, but I don't want to disrespect her. Consent is really important. Of course, consent is important. Again, I'm not saying it isn't, but there are so many folks that are afraid. And again, I'm sort of alluding to sexual intimacy, but not only sexual, all sorts of relational intimacy, where they're just afraid to just show up and be themselves. So the courage to do that is also a green flag. So when you see someone who's like, wow, this person is willing to be themselves and also respects me and is willing to be themselves with me, and part of the respect thing, and they'll hear what I say when I'm being honest with them. That's all green flag stuff. Who occurs to me to mention in that context is the researcher John Gottman. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's like very well known among the couples therapy community, because he has done research on couples for decades. And his most famous research is where he started with newlywed couples and brought them into his lab and interviewed them and videotaped them having conversations and all that kind of stuff, and then followed the same couples in some cases for like 25 years. And so what do you do if you follow couples for 25 years? Well, you see how they turned out. Some of them, like little under half split up. And, if he had a more or less random sample, and some of them stayed together and are happy about it, and some of them are not. So he looked and saw, like, let's look at the newlywed data. What might have been the green flags? So he identified two sets of green flags. Again, not the terms he used, but I like it. So what are his two sets of green flags, among other things? He said, well, one thing was when he would interview them and say, talk about something you disagree about, So he wouldn't say what to talk about, and he wouldn't say who should bring it up. Well, 80% of the time, it was the woman who brought it up. No surprise there. That didn't predict anything. It was most of the time it was the woman anyway. How she brought it up was highly predictive of success. The women who would hit him with a ton of bricks, the women who would just say, well, there you go again, you're being a jerk, that didn't work. The women who would say, well, yeah, there is something that's bothering me. Yeah, it's not the end of the world, but yeah, can we talk about this? I want to talk about it. Again, she could be quite assertive, but respectful. That worked. He called it the soft startup. That was predictive of success years later. Does it mean it's all up to women? Of course not, because what corresponded to that was the men who actually listened to her complaint, the men who actually, what he called it was accepting influence. The men who accepted influence from the woman, that was predictive of success as well. So in other words, I look at that using my terminology and say, oh yeah, the couples that were able to have an intimate conversation. They could be honest, even if it was a little scary. They could tolerate the anxiety. They were the ones who would do well. The ones who would freak out, the ones who would, and he talked about the red flags, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That's what Gottman talked about. Criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. That's the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. If you saw that in the newlywed conversation, don't expect them to be celebrating their 10th anniversary. It ain't going to happen. But the green flags, it really was about that sense of, yes, mutual respect and mutual honesty. That seems to be what does it.
That's cool. Among your answer, those groups of answers, what I heard underneath from a man's perspective is a fear of rejection.
Mm. Oh, yeah.
And you talked about a soft startup, where as opposed to the other way, which would seem to me would be an immediate rejection.
Yes.
And then you're just getting into the confirmation as you go into the details.
Yes, exactly. And, again, speaking broadly here, women as a group tend to be mystified with how hurt men can get. They don't know it because we don't show hurt, we show anger. So women are surprised at how much they can hurt men by how they speak to us. Often, again, big, overgeneralization. But it is often surprising. It's like, oh no, yeah, he's being kind of a jerk. He's being angry. He's being a jerk. Yeah, he shouldn't do that, right? That's our responsibility. But underneath that, you just really hurt him, indeed, by rejecting him. It's like, yeah, and if you get into what they call the attachment literature, there's all sorts of stuff about that, and I respect it. Like all of these theoretical constructs, they are useful, but don't take them too literally. Nothing explains everything. And the people who create these theories will often act as if they do explain everything, and they don't. But nevertheless, the attachment theory is a lot about that. There's some folks that are particularly susceptible to that message of rejection or that message of abandonment more than others. And they're the ones who are going to have a harder time controlling their reactions.
Okay, that all makes sense.
Yeah.
So when do you suggest is the right time to start therapy? Or should all couples do therapy proactively?
Yeah, I'm not of that camp. There are folks who say that. It's like, yeah, it's like going to the dentist, and getting your teeth cleaned periodically, which I do. I'm in favor of that. I get colonoscopies, that's like, before I was a psychologist, I was a statistician. I have a master's degree in statistics. And I really respect the data about colonoscopies. It's like, wow, here's a screening thing that actually seems to extend lives. It's really good. So I get colonoscopies. I don't think every couple needs couples therapy. I'm much more like the model. It's sort of like the family doctor model. When do you go to the family doctor? Well, yeah, I guess you do get checkups, but you go when there's something bothering you, and then you work on it. And if things are better, great. Call me when you need me. That's how I like to work with couples. When is the time to do it? Usually the time to do it was about 6 months before you actually realize you should do it. Although there's some people who would say, no, it's about 5 years before you realize you actually. So many people, when I'll ask, in fact, it is my usual second question. My first question to couples almost always is, how will you know if this is helping? I want to focus them right on the get-go of, well, is this helping? And it's up to you to figure that out. But my second question is, why are you doing this now? What was there something that happened that brought this about? Or, and very often the answer to that question will be, well, when we think back, we should have done this years ago. But not because everybody needs it. I think because there was stuff they hadn't realized that was sort of undermining their relationship, and they hadn't realized it yet. And if they had realized it sooner, maybe they could have done something about it sooner. So, when should you do it? It's kind of a circular answer. When you realize you should do it. How are you supposed to realize you should do it? Well, usually you didn't realize it as soon as you wish you had. But that's just normal. I mean, who wants to even know, there's something seriously wrong in our relationship? It's, denial exists for a reason too. It's like, you don't want to know that. When you can't ignore it anymore, that's usually when people are going to try therapy.
Okay. So what's next for Couples Therapy in 7 Words project? Are there any, you mentioned a new book. Do you do live events, and are there any other projects in the works?
We've done one live event so far. And I think we're going to plan another one, presumably. But in general, the podcast, we just keep doing the podcast because it's fun to do, and we're interviewing all kinds of guests. And we haven't narrowed the focus. We get anybody talking about anything vaguely related to couples, we're apt to have on. So we've interviewed all sorts of people. We keep doing it because it's fun. In terms of my own, books and stuff like that, the book I'm working on now, and I'm even willing now to say the title. I'm not 100% sure of the subtitle, but I'll tell you what the working subtitle is. The title of the book is The Passion Paradox. And the working subtitle at this point is When You Love Each Other and When You Feel Miles Apart and Still Love Each Other. That's who it's aimed at. Folks who feel miles apart and still love each other. So, and that's a lot of folks. That's lots of the folks I work with. They come in and they'll say, well, we do love each other, but we're not in love. Or we love each other, but somehow we can't seem to talk to each other. That sort of thing. And the book I'm working on now, more than any of the other ones I've written, is in fact a workbook. I call it a workbook. So that it is very oriented toward asking specific questions that you work through. And as you work through the book, it points you toward stuff to try, points you toward stuff that will, I hope, improve your relationship, or at least get you on the path to improving your relationship. So that's what I've been working on most recently.
Okay. Well, I'm starting to wind down the conversation, just have a couple questions left.
Sure.
But I can't leave without asking you this sort of out of left field question. Talking about writing a book and being a therapist, and also being in New England. made me think about the movie What About Bob?
Yes.
I'm sure you've seen that movie. Have you ever had a client like What About Bob?
I haven't, because I've never worked that way. There's a style like in that movie, right? It's interesting because that movie, and it was like 25, 30 years ago. It was quite a while ago.
It was like 1991, I think.
Yeah. So over 30 years ago. Yeah. There's an assumption in that movie, which people often still assume about therapy. There's a particular style of doing individual therapy with people that fosters that kind of dependence. And I've never wanted to work that way. I have never worked with people in a way that says, I'm your go-to for all your problems. I have worked with people in a way that says, I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to try and have a conversation with you. And again, it is about the relationship, but it's not about the sort of classic psychoanalytic idea or psychodynamic idea that says you're having the relationship with a therapist who's a blank slate. You can't know anything about the therapist. The therapist is a blank slate and you're working out your relationship problems in that relationship. No, that is not how I work. I'm working with people in a way that fosters their sense of responsibility for their own stuff. So I'm not, I've never said I'm available 24/7 if you're having a crisis. No, there are crisis lines for that purpose. And I've always been clear about that. It's like, no, we're going to have our conversations and they get genuine care. You know what I mean? They have a genuine me who genuinely cares about them, but I'm not the one that's going to be there with them on, and so if somebody showed up at my door, I'd be apt to call the police and wouldn't leave. It's like, no, I would not be doing whatever. I forgot who was playing the therapist in that one.
It was Richard Dreyfuss.
Richard Dreyfuss, that's right.
Yeah, Bill Murray was the client.
And Bill Murray was the client. Yeah. No, that was a hilarious movie, but no, that I have not run into that.
Up at Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Next door neighbor from Vermont. All right. So as a last question, I asked this for all of my guests. What one piece of advice do you have to leave with the listeners today on any subject?
Well, that's almost too easy because I have my 7 words, so it really is my 7 words because that was in effect, you just asked me a question very similar to what my colleague asked about couples therapy. Like, how do you do, what do you want to tell people? What I want to tell people is, well, think about those words, be kind, don't panic, and have faith, and go from there. That's basically what I would say.
Okay. That sounds like a good way to wind up this episode today. So our guest today has been Dr. Bruce Chalmer, who is co-host with his wife of the podcast Couples Therapy in 7 Words. Thank you for being here today, Bruce. I enjoyed this.
Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it too.
Please go to my website at podcastreallife.com for more information about my guest and the things we discussed today, including finally figuring out what Daryl's last name is.
I feel terrible about that, but there we are.
So that's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Stories from Real Life. Don't forget to subscribe and share. Let's meet right here every Tuesday and Friday. See you then.